Okay, so for this lecture, we're going to talk about marine chemistry, which is a follow-up to all of the water chemistry talk. And specifically what we're going to talk about in this lecture is what is dissolved in seawater, in the ocean. And so what we're looking at here is a rosette of bottles that that can be triggered individually so that you can get multiple water depths on one cast. So basically what they do is they lower this big rosette, so each one of these is a bottle. They lower this big rosette into the water, and when they're at a specific depth, they'll trigger one bottle to close, and then they'll lower it more and they'll trigger another bottle, and they'll keep on doing that until they've gotten water samples from multiple depths. Okay, so in seawater, we have lots of different ions that are dissolved. So ions, again, are charged, and therefore they are easy for water to dissolve because the oxygen side of a water molecule can attach to anything that's positively charged, and the hydrogen side of a water molecule can attach to anything that's negatively charged. Okay, so we have chloride and sodium being the greatest, right, salt, and then sulfate, magnesium, calcium, potassium, and bicarbonate are also in seawater. And then you also find minor elements in seawater as well. So you have bromine, strontium, boron, silicon, fluorine, and then also various metals as well, all the way down to gold. Okay, so where do these ions come from? So ocean salinity is essentially dissolved solids, right? So they're ions. So they come from various processes, and as you'll recall from the lecture about how our oceans got salty, we talked about how chlorine comes out in volcanic eruptions, and then the sodium and other minerals are dissolved from the actual land on the seafloor. So the processes that are putting these in are taking them out at the same rate, okay? So salinity varies throughout our world's oceans. So if you go from the Atlantic Ocean to the Mediterranean Ocean, you're going to find that the salinity in the water is different. But the proportions of the major salts in the seawater doesn't vary. So it's the ratio of major salts that stays constant regardless of what ocean you're in. For example, if the salinity is 34 parts per thousand, then chloride will make up 56% of those dissolved solids. If the salinity is 40 parts per thousand, chloride will still make up 56% of those dissolved solids. Okay, so that's the law of constant proportions, basically, or Forshammer's law. So is the ocean getting more and more salty as it gets older? What do you think? I kind of gave you the answer already, a little bit. So the answer is no. The ocean is actually in chemical equilibrium for any conservative constituents. So all of those ions that we talked about, when I mentioned that the processes that put them in take them out at the same rate, that should have given you a hint that no, the ocean is not getting saltier as it gets older. It stays the same saltiness. But what can change are non-conservative constituents of water, such as oxygen or carbon dioxide. Okay, so ions are being added to and removed from the ocean at the same rate, and that doesn't include the non-conservative constituents again. Okay, so the gases that are dissolved in seawater change, and in Earth's atmosphere, you can see that the majority of Earth's atmosphere is nitrogen, and then you also have oxygen, of course, which is why we're able to live, and then you have smaller proportions of argon, carbon dioxide, neon, helium, methane, and lots of other elements in small proportions. So gases that are dissolved in seawater are not exactly the same as in the atmosphere. So then this is because the solubility or the ability of it to dissolve into the water is different than its ability to dissolve into the air or to be in the air. Okay, so nitrogen over here, this is the percent of nitrogen in the atmosphere, 78.08. This is the percent of it in the ocean, 48%. Oxygen in the atmosphere is 20.95, but oxygen in the ocean is 36%. Okay, and then carbon dioxide as of 2008 was 0.038 in the atmosphere, and in the seawater it's about 15. So nitrogen is less soluble in water than air, and oxygen is more soluble in water than air. You see that if you compare the proportion of oxygen to nitrogen in the atmosphere and oxygen to nitrogen in the water, you'll see that there is more oxygen proportionally than in the atmosphere, and there is less nitrogen proportionally than in the atmosphere. Okay, so with carbon dioxide, you can see it's much more soluble in water than it is in the air, just like with oxygen. Now the temperature of the water will actually affect the solubility or the ability of those gases to dissolve. So here we have two graphs that are showing us the solubility of oxygen in seawater and of nitrogen in seawater with changing temperatures. So you can see that as the temperature increases going to the right, your oxygen concentration goes down, and so does your nitrogen concentration. Gases dissolve much easier in colder water than in warmer water. And that's why in this image here, which shows us the amount of oxygen in the sea surface, that's why the places that tend to be warmer, which are around the equator, tend to be lower in oxygen concentrations than the areas that are colder towards the poles. They tend to have higher oxygen concentrations. Okay, so I should have introduced the scale to you, sorry. Light purple or purple, those are lower concentrations of oxygen, and the orange to red, those are higher concentrations of oxygen. So you can see that in warmer water you have less oxygen, in colder water you have more oxygen. Okay, so nitrogen, oxygen, and carbon dioxide are the most common dissolved gases in seawater. Oxygen and carbon dioxide will change based on activity of living things. Okay, so where does oxygen come from? Might be a tricky question for some of you. And where do you think the carbon dioxide comes from? Well, there's actually multiple sources for both of them. But as far as living things go, photosynthesis by plants and phytoplankton produce oxygen and take up carbon dioxide. Whereas respiration by animals and bacteria, they actually use up the oxygen and produce carbon dioxide. Therefore, the concentration of oxygen and carbon dioxide in a particular body of water is dependent on how much photosynthesis is occurring in that water and how much respiration is occurring in that water. And we also see that when you go from the seafloor down, the concentration of gases vary as well. So in this graph, we're looking at the surface of the water, 0 depth, all the way down to about 4,500 meters depth. Okay, so y-axis is depth. You should get used to looking at graphs like this because when we're talking about the ocean, we usually have them upside down, starting at 0 up here because we're talking about depth. And then over on the x-axis, you have concentrations of carbon dioxide and oxygen, increasing as you go to the right. Okay, so if we go up to the surface here, we see we have a blue line that's oxygen, we have a red line that's carbon dioxide. So if we go up to the surface here, what do you see as far as the concentration of oxygen? Do you see that it's, is it a high concentration or a low concentration, relative speaking? You should say that the oxygen concentration is high. And what about the carbon dioxide concentration? The carbon dioxide concentration is low. The reason for that is that organisms that photosynthesize live in those surface waters where the light penetrates through and supports photosynthesis. So photosynthetic organisms use up carbon dioxide and they produce oxygen. So that's why we have high oxygen and low carbon dioxide. But then as you go down, you see this drastic decline in oxygen and an increase in carbon dioxide. That's because photosynthesis isn't going on down here because it's not light enough for photosynthesis. Therefore, you basically have instead organisms that respire and use up the oxygen and produce carbon dioxide in the process. So photosynthesizers at the ocean surface, where there is sunlight, cause high levels of oxygen and low levels of carbon dioxide. Then at greater depths, respiration by animals causes lower levels of oxygen and higher levels of carbon dioxide. Now, the chemicals that are dissolved in the water affect the acidity or the pH of the water. So pH is a scale that is based on how many hydrogen ions are dissolved. Okay, so this is the pH scale right here. It goes from 0 to 14, and each number is a 10-fold increase. Okay, so the neutral point is 7. So anything that's 7 is said to be pH neutral, and anything that is greater than 7 is said to be basic or alkaline. Anything that is less than 7 is said to be acidic. Things that are basic or alkaline take hydrogen ions out of the water. Things that are acidic add hydrogen ions to the water. Okay, so an acid increases hydrogen ions in water. For example, HCl is hydrochloric acid. When you put it in water, it becomes hydrogen ions and chloride. So because it increases the hydrogen ions in the water, it's an acid. A base decreases the hydrogen ions and increases the hydroxide, OH negative hydroxide ions in the water. So here I have sodium hydroxide. It's a base because when you add it to water, it becomes sodium and hydroxide. So that's increasing the hydroxide in the water, and it actually decreases the hydrogen ions because they will bond to it. Okay, so here are some common substances, again, along the pH scale. So in this scale, I just want to orient you, 0 is up here. So that's in reverse of the scale that I just showed you. 0 is at the top, and so that is the most acidic, and then 14 is down here. So that's the most basic. Okay, so some acidic things include hydrochloric acid, gastric acid, lemon juice, wine, vinegar, beer, coffee, and rainwater is actually slightly acidic as well. Pure water is neutral, and then we have some things that are basic, such as blood and egg whites. Seawater is slightly basic. Soap, milk of magnesium, ammonia, hair remover, it's very basic, oven cleaner, and sodium hydroxide. Okay, so what is the pH of seawater? So generally, this graph is showing us the pH of seawater as you go from the surface down. You see that that line kind of wiggles a little bit. The average ocean pH is about 8. Okay, as you go down in depth, the pH declines, and then it comes back up, and then it declines again. Okay, so pH of seawater is slightly alkaline, and it varies slightly with depth as it mixes with different components, and as we learned, oxygen concentrations, nitrogen concentrations, carbon dioxide concentrations, those all change, and so all of those things are going to affect the pH of the water as well. There are also very important elements that are inorganic nutrients that are in our ocean. What we call an inorganic nutrient is something that does not contain carbon, but is required for the production of organic matter. So it's, in other words, it's necessary for living things in order for them to live. And so for the inorganic nutrients discussion, we're going to focus on phytoplankton and other plant-like organisms, okay, and what nutrients they need. So the important nutrients in the ocean, particularly for phytoplankton and other photosynthesizers, are phosphorus, nitrogen, iron, and silicon. So phosphorus is mainly as phosphate, nitrogen is mainly in the form of nitrate and nitrite, and then silicon is mainly in the form of silicic acid. So phosphorus is important because it's in lots of different biological molecules. such as DNA and RNA, and then ADP and ATP, which are important for energy production in your body. Nitrogen is found in proteins. It's also in nucleic acids, DNA and RNA. It's found in enzymes. Enzymes are proteins, and those are things that allow for chemical reactions to happen in your body quickly enough that your body can still survive and keep functioning. Nitrogen is also in chitin, which makes up the outer skeleton, or what we call the exoskeleton, of shrimp and crabs and all arthropods or insects, in fact. So in the ocean, nitrogen is the limiting factor. That means that nitrogen is in low concentration as compared to phosphorus. So the main thing that is limiting the growth of primary producers in the oceans is nitrogen. Here is the phosphorus cycle. And the phosphorus cycle, most of phosphorus is supplied on land from sediments. So some ways that phosphorus goes into the ocean includes fertilizer runoff. So since plants in the ocean need phosphorus, plants on land need phosphorus too. And so what farmers will do is they will get fertilizer, which contains phosphorus and nitrogen and usually potassium and probably some other minerals as well. They put that on their crop, and that helps their plants to grow. But when it rains, that fertilizer then runs off and goes into a local waterway, which eventually will make its way to the ocean. Upwelled sediment will bring nutrients up to the surface, because where it's really important is in the surface where those photosynthetic organisms are living, right? Nutrients down here aren't really going to be helpful to them because they're not in the same water as them. It's all the way down deep, and these guys need to live at the surface where there's sunlight. Weathering and erosion on land, defecation on land by organisms that have consumed phosphorus, that have phosphorus in their bodies. When they poop it out, it goes into the water by way of runoff. Volcanoes will add phosphorus, and dead plant materials that are then washed away into the ocean also are a source of phosphorus. Phosphorus is also taken out, and that's why we call it a cycle. So it's taken out of the water by phytoplankton that use it, and then those phytoplankton get consumed by bigger organisms, bigger types of plankton, which are called zooplankton, and then larger organisms consume those as well. So in that way, it's taken out of the water and put into living organisms. And when those living organisms die and decompose, then that sinks to the bottom, and those nutrients can be brought back up by way of upwelling, which I failed to mention to you before what upwelling is. Upwelling means that water is actually moving from deep down up towards the surface. So that's what's bringing nutrients from down here up to the surface where these organisms can use them. Okay. And then, of course, if land animals are eating the animals in the ocean, then that's also taking it out of the ocean. The nitrogen cycle is similar, but there is an important first step before it gets to be the same as the phosphorus cycle. Nitrogen, the majority of nitrogen is in our atmosphere as nitrogen gas. This is not available to living organisms. So nitrogen gas, or N2, is not bioavailable. So I shouldn't say it's not bioavailable to all living organisms. It's just not available to plants and photosynthesizing organisms. So what needs to happen first is that the nitrogen gas needs to be fixed or changed into a form that can be used by plants and other photosynthetic organisms. So nitrogen in the atmosphere is fixed to nitrate or nitrite. And organisms that do this are bacteria. Legumes on land can also do this. The process of lightning strikes can do this. And then, of course, fertilizer production in big factories can do this as well, which is actually like kind of a volatile and dangerous process. So basically, fertilizer plants on land are taking the nitrogen gas and turning it into fertilizer for those farmers that I just mentioned to put on their crops, right? And so once you have it in the nitrate or the nitrite form, now it can be taken up by organisms. And then the same processes that put the phosphorus into the ocean also put nitrogen into the ocean. The same processes that take phosphorus out of the ocean also take nitrogen out of the ocean. So it's kind of the same kind of cycle after that point. Now, sometimes we end up with excess amounts of nitrogen and phosphorus in our waterways. And the process of eutrophication is where you have a body of water that has too much nutrients, basically. And because there's so many nutrients, you end up having this huge amount of plant growth and algae growth in your waterway, which doesn't sound so bad at first, but let me tell you what happens with that. Okay, so first, when you get the excess amounts of nutrients in the water, the plants and algae grow and reproduce. But they grow so fast that we would consider that overgrowth. So there is, for algae, when they grow really quickly, we call that an algal bloom. Okay, then because they all have about the same life cycle, when they live and die, it happens all at the same time. So when the plants and the algae die, they sink down to the seafloor. And additionally, having that much algae in the water can actually make it so that the light doesn't penetrate through as deep. And therefore, that can actually cause living plants and algae underneath them to die as well. Okay, so the plants and the algae then die, and they sink down to the seafloor. And also in the water column, their dead material can then be decomposed by bacteria. And when these bacteria are decomposing that dead matter, right, the dead algae or the dead plants, when they decompose them and break them down into smaller molecules, they also use oxygen up in the process. And so therefore, when you end up with excessive amounts of nutrients in the water, that eventually leads to low oxygen in the water. So more dead matter decomposing equals more oxygen being used up, and that can lead to anoxic conditions, which are conditions in which there's not enough oxygen in the water to support respiring organisms. And you can even see like fish kills or major die-offs of fish due to this. There are other important nutrients as well. For example, iron is important for bacteria, and bacteria are the nitrogen fixers that provide the plants and algae with nitrogen in the nitrite or nitrate form. And so because of that, iron is an important nutrient. Then there are organisms that need certain nutrients in the water to make their shells. For example, we have diatoms that make their shells out of silica. We have lots of organisms that make their shells out of calcium carbonate. Just a couple shown here, right? We have urchins and we have this pretty abalone shell. That's the basis of these shells is calcium carbonate. So calcium carbonate is another important nutrient. Okay, so if you have any questions, please post them on the weekly discussion.